Hello, everyone. It's great to have you joining us today. I want to begin by acknowledging that I am speaking to you today from the traditional unceded territories of the Musqueam, the Squamish, and the Tsleil-Waututh people. I want to thank all of you for joining us for this session, this dialogue on research security, collaboration in an era of increased risks. I want to thank our panelists for joining us today. We're joined by Eric Bisaillon, the Director of Security Architecture, Canadian Centre for Cybersecurity, Martha Crago, Vice Principal at McGill University, and Tricia Geddes, Deputy Director, Policy and Strategic Partnerships at the Canadian Security Intelligence Service. So welcome to our three panelists. It's great to have you here with us today to discuss research security in Canada. I want to just begin by kind of setting the stage for this discussion. Science and technology really are international enterprises, and we all recognize this. This enterprise is characterized by global collaboration as well as global competition. And we have seen over the past decades the Canadian research landscape has evolved. We're increasingly recruiting and benefiting from international students and scholars, and we've embarked on complex global science projects. International cooperation is vitally important to amplify research and accelerate discoveries. It brings together top minds, resources, and facilities to solve some of the world's most pressing problems and challenges. As you know, open and collaborative research is essential to advancing research and innovation. When we think about these challenges, they include things like climate change, food security, public health, and especially right now, the COVID pandemic. We know these challenges are better confronted in a collaborative way. Therefore, the exchange of Canadian knowledge and resources helps build the linkages and skills that support scientific excellence and innovation. While we recognize that science is ideally built on open intellectual exchange, we also recognize that there are several recent incidents that have led to concern that the openness of the Canadian research ecosystem is being taken advantage of by other countries. I think that increasingly we're hearing concerns about unfair competition. And this is certainly entwined with concerns about the Canadian economic and national security in a rapidly changing world. There's growing awareness domestically and internationally of the potential for research, science, and innovation to be stolen and used by opportunistic actors looking to exploit Canada's research knowledge for their own benefit and innovation. The shift to remote work and other unique factors have also created situations that malicious actors may use to advance their own interests at the expense of others. Over the past 2 years, countries around the globe have introduced measures to counter foreign interference in universities and respond to new threats to the integrity and security of the research system. Safeguarding research is a shared responsibility. It's shared by all Canadian individuals, organizations, governments, institutions that are involved in the research enterprise. So today, we're going to be examining this tension, this need for open science, but also this need for concerns about paying attention to concerns about security. Today's panel is going to explore the importance of research security and how globalized events like the COVID-19 pandemic continue to influence the threat landscape. Our three panelists are going to discuss the risks to research security, the importance of identifying and mitigating potential risks, and best practices for research security. So what's going to happen today is we're going to hear from each of our panelists in turn. They'll have about 15 to 20 minutes to speak to you. Then we're going to have a moderated question and answer session. And I encourage you to post your questions. I'll be looking for those and we'll be helping to facilitate a discussion with the panelists. So to begin with, I'd like pass the stage over to Tricia Geddes. And Tricia is the Deputy Director, as I mentioned, of Policy and Strategic Partnerships. Full bios for all of our speakers are available to participants, and I encourage you to check out those bios. So without any further ado, I'll pass it over to you, Tricia.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Dr. Johnson, for that introduction, and thank you to all of you for inviting me to be here with you today. Very pleased to be here with you, virtually even. to discuss some of the ways that CSIS's work in recent years has transformed to meet the changing nature of the threats to Canada. I'm going to pay particular attention to how globalized events like COVID-19 have had a tremendous and immediate impact on threats and our work. And I will focus importantly on how we can work with all of you in safeguarding research, while still understanding and appreciating your commitment and ours to the importance of open and collaborative science, as Dr. Johnson mentioned in her remarks. This is a very complex challenge. We, as Canada's Security and Intelligence Agency, are learning and adapting as we go, and we're learning and adapting, frankly, alongside all of you. Events such as today hopefully help us to better appreciate each other's critical roles and how we can support you as we work on this shared area of interest and accountability. First, for those of you who don't know, let me start with a very small bit of background on who we are and what we do. In short, CSIS collects intelligence and information, we analyze it, and then we advise on threats to the security of Canada. For the sake of this discussion, we'll be focusing primarily on the threats of espionage and foreign interference, but of course, we also prioritize threats of terrorism and extremist violence. One way to look at the importance of what CSIS does in confronting the scope of these threats is to understand that terrorism threatens our lives, while espionage and foreign interference threatens our way of life. Defending Canadians and Canadian interests from both of these threats is what inspires the people of CSIS to do the work they do. Before moving to the threats of interest today, namely the threats to our science and research ecosystem, I would just flag that while the threat of hostile activities by state actors has grown exponentially, protecting Canadians from the threat of terror incidents does not abate. We have been growing increasingly concerned about the threat of ideologically motivated extremism. We used to call it the far right or the far left, but now appreciate that these are poor terms to describe the assortment of ideologies that can form the basis for an act of terror by certain individuals who are motivated to violence. We also can never take our eye off the threat posed by individuals, often lone wolves, who give little advance notice before carrying out an attack in the name of Daesh or other terror organizations. Recent and tragic events in Europe remind us that that threat has not been close to eliminated. Amidst that threat landscape, however, are the threats emanating from not one, but several state actors who do not abide by democratic norms in the ways in which they pursue their objectives and strategic interests. As the world becomes more competitive, states are naturally seeking every advantage to position themselves as leaders in a lucrative global economy. As a result of this competitive drive, some hostile state actors leverage all elements of state power, including their intelligence services, and in some cases that is very vast, to advance their national interests at Canada's expense. This threat represents the greatest danger to Canada's national security and can have a tremendous negative impact on our economic growth, on Canadian jobs, on our ability to innovate, and on our sovereignty and national interest. In the Cold War era, when CSIS was founded, 1984, and our authorities were created by Parliament, espionage activity was typically directed towards illicitly obtaining Canadian political, military, and diplomatic secrets. Most of these were secured in top-secret government bunkers and military facilities. These targets remain attractive to our adversaries, but in today's data and high-tech-driven world, the most advanced research and discovery is conducted in relatively open and accessible university labs and small startups. Cutting-edge Canadian research in the life sciences, telecommunications, and computing are increasingly targeted by foreign intelligence services. We have seen this. It is not an exaggeration to point out that scientific and medical discovery and advances in artificial intelligence and quantum computing, to name just a few sectors, are today's equivalent of the most closely guarded Cold War nuclear secrets. Threat actors use a variety of covert and clandestine means to gain access and steal the information they seek. Equally, the threat can emanate from outside our organizations, like a cyber attack. Equally, it can originate from within, for example, insider threats. We have seen a significant shift in the way that Canadian research is threatened over the years. Foreign states are seeking to acquire Canadian technology, IP, R&D, and expertise by using a range of traditional and non-traditional collection tradecraft, including through undisclosed academic talent plans, shadow labs, and other research and technological partnerships. Threat actors also attempt to steal information and research through reliance on informed insiders and proxies, and through manipulation and coercion of students or facility in extreme cases. Indeed, it is a feature of the modern espionage threat that spies now tend to wear lab coats, not trench coats. It can also be enabled and facilitated by a lack of awareness, due diligence, mitigation, and resilience in our institutions. In order that we do not unwittingly assist our adversaries in achieving their objectives at our expense, we need to do all we can to protect our institutions and our most valued assets. We at CSIS actually bear much accountability in ensuring that there is no lack of awareness, including amongst all of you, albeit we are sometimes somewhat frustrated by the constraints of our legislation that enables us only to share classified information with the government. I will commit to you that this is an area we are actively exploring. Are there ways that we can go beyond the unclassified briefings that we provide to all of you to ensure that we can provide business and research institutes with even more targeted information to support your decision making? For now, however, we feel proud of the efforts we have undertaken over the past years, and particularly, I would say we're very proud of what we've undertaken over the last few months in moving outside of our comfort zone of advising government and pursuing a richer discussion with academia and our business sector, to name just a few non-traditional partners for CSIS. This is relatively new. When I first got to CSIS about 6 years ago, I would say that it was very rare that we would go outside of our normal government partners to discuss these types of threat activities, and now I would say it has become the norm of our work. We are full partners in work led by industry and Public Safety Canada to launch initiatives such as the Safeguarding Your Research portal, where Canadian researchers can find tools, guidance, and information on protecting research data and intellectual property from theft, espionage, and cyber attacks. We are working with these government departments to inform the tools they provide to you with the most recent understanding of the threats and the tactics that are being used. We support our own engagement directly with universities. We are also working with those partners, however, to deliver broad workshops, which are now even easier in the virtual world. In a research context, some of the advice we are working to better articulate to you is, where is the threat the greatest? What areas of research are of greatest interest to states who may use hostile means to acquire strategic advantage? What are the types of activities you should monitor? What are the tools that are available to you to be able to inform your mitigation means? We aim to support you in advising on how to bolster protections for valuable intellectual property and research, how to ensure that you're thinking about transparency and due diligence in your funding and cooperation arrangements, and how to increase awareness generally about the threats. We are undertaking this discussion at all levels, from individual researchers we meet with on very sensitive research to broad strategic discussions with senior administration and executives. This last year has been extremely instructive to us, as we launched a much more thorough outreach campaign than I think we thought we would be doing at this point, to help protect valuable biopharma research within Canada's national response to the COVID-19 pandemic. In addition to the benefits of us being able to offer advice directly, it also gave us the opportunity to learn from the research community. I think we are much more sensitive today than we were even a couple of months ago to the needs of open and collaborative research. I would like to believe we are also much more understanding of the nuances of this issue, but at the same time that we are becoming trusted partners, so that you all be as well equipped as possible, that when you see a threat emerging, you will recognize it and you will call us for help and advice, either generally on the threat or on a very specific issue. If you'll just give me a couple of minutes, I just want to expand a little bit, because I think using COVID as an example for how we are engaging with academia will give you a sense of what we're trying to achieve here. On March 23rd, the federal government announced the start of major investments in Canadian biopharma companies and researchers to help in the development of a vaccine. It was all part of a more than $1 billion national medical research strategy, which shone a spotlight on Canadian research entities at the very cutting edge of medical innovation. As a brief aside, I began my career working at the Public Health Agency of Canada, so I have lots of familiarity with just how incredibly advanced we are in our science and research development in the area of public health. So I'm very proud of this and very proud to have been part of the protections of this over the last few months. While Canadians placed a great deal of hope squarely on the shoulders of those researchers at this time, we quickly realized that we were not the only ones who'd be closely watching and tracking their progress. CSIS counterintelligence investigators who work all across Canada were beginning to report on what looked like an increasing level of coordinated activity by some foreign governments to track Canadian personal protective equipment production and vaccine and therapeutics research. As additional intelligence suggesting that hostile states were actively targeting this research and development continued to pile up from our field offices across Canada and from international partners, we quickly began to adjust the focus of our intelligence collection and started to drive a very public outreach effort. On top of our ongoing pre-pandemic work, we needed to better understand how espionage and foreign interference may be affecting Canada's vaccine and therapeutics research and medical and economic supply chains. As our intelligence collection continued to provide new and better insights into the early efforts of foreign state actors to target Canadian research institutes and steal their intellectual property, we quickly realized that we were in a race to get to those institutes and warn them of the threat, frankly, before our adversaries got to them. Our new branch created at CSIS, entitled Academic Outreach and Stakeholder Engagement, a small team that reports to me, quickly compiled lists of research entities and life sciences institutes across Canada that were deemed most vulnerable to threats of espionage and foreign interference. And we worked with our regional offices who span the country to reach out to these institutes and explain the nature of the threat levied against them to help harden their defenses. We applied both an air campaign and a ground game to reach as many companies and researchers as we could in as little a time as we had to us. This involved large webinar briefings for national medical and biopharmaceutical associations, universities and health networks involving dozens of administrators, scientists and researchers, and also smaller in-person meetings with individual institutes and companies, in some cases where we had some real awareness and analysis of a very specific threat. All told, over the space of a couple of months, we directly reached over 2,000 Canadians, representing approximately 250 private and public sector institutes and companies involved in Canada's response to COVID-19. This effort spanned dozens of key economic and health sectors from Nanaimo to St. John's and everywhere in between, including in Canada's largest cities and smallest towns and universities big and small. And as this external outreach operation was happening, we were also closely working with Government of Canada partners, briefing Cabinet and our Minister on this developing threat, providing timely advice and information that contributed directly to the government's ability to secure vaccine contracts with leading biopharmaceutical companies and to establish secure delivery and distribution networks that we believe will ensure Canadians receive timely and reliable access to a vaccine once it is proven safe and effective. This national operation is really quite unique for CSIS. This is not something we had undertaken before in the past, and frankly, we weren't exactly sure how it was going to go and how it was going to be received by the public. I am very pleased that we received almost nothing but universal receptivity to this outreach campaign. I think people were quite delighted to see CSIS coming a bit out of the shadows and being able to speak quite directly to people that were affected. This was an example of CSIS working at its collective best from coast to coast to investigate the threats, assess their severity and potential impact on Canadian interests, and to quickly get that information into the right hands so that it could be most helpful at the right time. So I want to close my remarks by saying that we simply cannot do this type of work without your confidence and without the confidence of Canadians. I hope and trust that our increased efforts at transparency and engagement will ensure that you have that confidence, that when you work with us, you are working with a trusted partner. We are very open, much more than ever before, because these threats require all of us to work together. As leaders in the field of knowledge, innovation, and research, your institutions are of significant interest to threat actors. You are leaders in your field because of the cutting-edge research and collaboration that takes place on your campuses. We are absolutely committed to supporting you in mitigating threats against our national interests. I would just close by saying we're learning as we go and we are adapting as we go. So I'm looking forward to the dialogue, looking forward to any of the feedback you might have, and looking forward to working with you in the future. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Tricia, for that really interesting presentation, and to really be focusing in particular in the biopharma example, I think really gives us a sense of the ways that you are working in new ways. So thanks for that. We'll look forward to probing a little bit more in the question period. But for now, let me turn it over to our next panelist, Eric Bisaillon. Eric is the Director, Security Architecture Branch with the Canadian Centre for Cybersecurity. Eric, it's great to have you with us. We'll look forward to hearing from you now. Thank you.
Thank you, Joy, and thank you for that introduction. And thanks, everyone, for having me here today. I'm happy to be here to be able to talk to you with my co-panelists on some of the threats and some of the mitigations that we are working with many partners across the industry to address. As mentioned, I'm with the Canadian Centre for Cybersecurity, and we're really the focal point in the Government of Canada for all things cyber related from an IT security perspective, both for the Government of Canada, but also with the creation of the Cyber Centre a year and a half ago. the mandate of our organization was really to start working across 15 or so critical infrastructure pillars in order to provide advice and guidance and services to prevent cyber threats and to increase the overall security of Canadians from a cybersecurity perspective. Today, I wanted to focus a little bit following my colleagues' highlight of the interest, certainly, and the threat that they are now seeing regarding research and development organizations, both COVID-related and others. I wanted to focus on the IT security perspective and take a little bit of a look at the threats that we're seeing from our perspective into this domain. So when we look at a cyber threat actor in general, what we see is that these actors develop and deploy malicious tools and software in order to get at the information, get at the technology, or the resources, or the relationships, or even the opinions and the reputation of Canada and of Canada's institutions. That is the motivation behind some of the cyber activities that we are seeing. Of course, that was before we got into this pandemic situation, and we now see further use of the current situation in order to continue along with some of the methods that these actors were utilizing before. But they now have a COVID-19 flavor to them. So what we're seeing now in recent months, of course, with the pandemic, is COVID-19 themed lures, if you will. So phishing emails have been around and phishing techniques have been around for a long time. Now we're seeing a rise in COVID-related phishing, whether they would be to leverage the sort of anxiety and stress of people and organizations already struggling with various preoccupations. So actors are often using these elements to, if you want, do better targeting and have better success on their phishing campaigns. We also see ransomware. Ransomware has also been around for a long time. It's targeting many sectors. All sectors are, we have observed, have been targeted by ransomware. And of course, the medical sector and the healthcare, so the medical, the healthcare sector, as well as research and development organizations are not impervious to being targeted by ransomware. And I'll speak a little bit about that a little more later. And we're also seeing some, though less so in the COVID space, but some influence campaigns that continue to be pervasive in the online world. So if we look at the lures and themes, and I mentioned this before, the population who would perhaps be already careful with some of the communications that they are getting in the form of spam or in the form of phishing, may be a little bit less prudent in these times when the level of stress and anxiety is already high due to COVID. So we're seeing a lot of email, SMS messages and advertisements that target, and it's anywhere from advertising counterfeit medical supplies, illicit fraudulent donations, supporting other fraudulent schemes, attempting to replicate branding of legitimate organizations. And the goal of this is often to deliver, often to deliver malware or ransomware in an attempt to compromise victims for the gains, whether they be financial or intellectual property or even reputational. We've also seen, ourselves being the government of Canada, not being shielded from this. We've seen campaigns of ransomware or malware that have been purposefully repurposing the legitimate offerings of the government of Canada, such as the emergency relief benefits, and some of the information websites related to COVID as new ways and fake ways, new vectors to get into people's devices and computers. And we are involved in numerous, we've taken down in the Cyber Center with the help of our industry partners, thousands of illegitimate fake websites that have purported to be a facade of a legitimate emergency relief benefit or collaboration website or so forth and so on. And so that is something that we've seen definitely on the rise during these times. In terms of ransomware, I think what's important to realize and to relate it to this conversation is that Canada's among the top-ranking countries that are impacted by ransomware. It's almost certain that a majority of the ransomware attacks in Canada are unreported or not reported to authorities. From a legal prosecution perspective, there are little, if no, avenues often to prosecute the perpetrators of this cybercrime. And I think importantly, as in any complex systems, there are often cases where ransomware is a means to an end, sometimes to financial profit, but also sometimes to obfuscate some more serious or more advanced state actor activities. We've seen state actors use often techniques that resemble commercial techniques for financial gain, but really while this is being employed, they also have the ability to traverse networks and devices and gain some insight into perhaps intellectual property or sensitive information from organizations. In terms of that foreign intelligence collection aspect, we've seen some shifts in this pandemic, and I won't repeat the excellent words from my colleague Tricia there on the threat piece. What we are seeing from a Cyber Center perspective is that almost certainly Canada's reputation as a world leader in health, in biotechnology, and in R&D in many disciplines are definitely witnessed as a motivation behind the increased targeting that we've seen online from a lot of the reported compromise that we have observed. Whether it's because we are building up effort in the research community to rapidly develop COVID-19 testing technology or to develop a COVID-19 vaccine, we have seen numerous examples of increased targeting in this space. So what we're doing to help across this in these times and across research and development organizations is, and I will point you to our website for some of the further advice and guidance that we provide in the space. What I like to do is we talk about the threat, and I like to talk about some of the elements of what to do to defend against this. And I find that while we can't prescribe things to eliminate all risk, having a more developed cybersecurity posture with some basic advice and guidance often takes care of a lot of these certainly more basic threats that we see. So what we're doing now, I've mentioned before, some takedown operations for fraudulent domains and websites that pose as legitimate GC organizations, Government of Canada organizations, or services, or other related institutions. We're applying an array of cyber defense services across and advice and guidance across government and our partners, including in the health sector and the research sector. We're putting out publications nearly every week on our website that we promote through our blogs and social media as well, on how to better secure your devices and your networks, and your companies, your organizations, networks against this situation, and in general as well against the increased the rise in cyber threat. And we've also worked over the last few months with CIRA, the Canadian Internet Registry Authority, to provide specific threat feeds indicators into a free domain name system. It's a free domain name firewall system called Canadian Shield. So if you we've been recommending the use of this service in organizations and individuals to help block some of the cyber threats that are more prevalent, especially during these times. Now, with this, you benefit from the array of detection and learning that we've had at the Cyber Center in your homes or your individual organizations. We also provide guidance to users, whether they're individual users or small business users as well, or to IT security branches within organizations to enable them to train user awareness. So things like avoiding phishing, not taking the bait, avoiding phishing attacks, avoiding the transfer of sensitive information over emails, using corporate devices assigned by your organization and managed by your employer whenever possible for these types of activities. If using personal accounts and devices, securing them with multi-factor authentication is a very important an important security measure that you can take. And of course, updating your devices regularly and automatically are some of the key elements of guidance that we issue. So one of the last things I'll say is, in working with Tricia and her team in academic outreach, we've produced a single placemat of cybersecurity advice and guidance, for research and development organizations during COVID-19. That's available on our website, but we've also handed it out in specific briefings to organizations that are involved in research and development. And so these have some cybersecurity best practices in there, anything from cyber hygiene to tips for remote working, practices for strong passwords and passphrases, how to use cloud securely with defense in depth, protecting your organization from malware, using Bluetooth technology, and so forth and so on, as well as a snapshot of the 12 baseline cybersecurity controls that we recommend for small and medium organizations. And those are 12 controls that we believe are some of the most accessible and also some of the most impactful controls that an organization can put in place to eliminate a lot of the threats that I've mentioned today. Things like having an incident response plan, patching operating systems and applications automatically, enabling your security software, using strong authentication, providing employee training, backing up and encrypting your data, so in the case of ransomware, securing your mobility, securing your websites, and your portable media, and so forth and so on. So I would encourage you to visit our website, www.cyber.gc.ca, where you can find a lot of this guidance. And so finally, there's always more discussions to be had, and we'd be happy to hear from any of you for your questions or any specific requests for information that we can provide. So the address for that is contact@cyber.gc.ca. That's our contact center, and it will point you to the right place and the right experts in the Cyber Center that can answer your specific security questions. We're also on Instagram at CSC_CSD or on Twitter at cybercenter_CA. So thank you very much for your attention today and for the really important work that you do. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Eric. Certainly very sobering to hear about all these attempts, both phishing, ransomware, etc., but also really heartening to hear about your engagement with the research community and some of the very practical tips that you have. I'm going to encourage audience members to post questions, and we'll be getting to those questions after our third speaker. and we'll look forward to engaging in more detail in this discussion then. But let's move on to our next speaker. Really pleased to be joined by Martha Crago today. Martha, of course, is the Vice Principal at McGill University and has been very involved in a number of working groups related to cybersecurity, research risk, etc. So Martha, it's great to have you with us today. I look forward to hearing from you next. Martha, you're muted.
Oh, that won't do. I don't think I am muted.
Yeah, no, it's fixed now. Sorry about that.
Fixed? Okay. All right, so it's a pleasure to be here and a pleasure to be in this company of people. You know, change is hard to adapt to, and I think that the last 7 or 8 months has shown us what it means to have to change and have to adapt. For many, many years, I was an enormous promoter of international partnership, international collaboration. I had much of it in my own field of research. I was a VP of International Affairs at the University of Montreal. And then things began to change. And so in 2017, we had visitors that wanted to come see us at the U15 Vice President of Research Committee. And at the time I was chair of that committee, and I thought, why not? And they came from the US and Australia, and they talked to us about how things were changing in their perceptions of what was being called foreign influence, that sometimes now we call foreign interference. So this was a bit of an eye-opener to a lot of people in the room. Immediately we began to think it would be useful to start to have more discussions with government. So we understood where the agency, where CSIS, where the granting councils, global affairs, where everybody was. So those discussions began in the winter of 2018. And, you know, we've all had to move from this notion of science diplomacy as being a great thing. And I will say there are a number of Canadian researchers following in the footsteps of Pierre Elliott Trudeau, of Norman Bethune, who were early people to go into China just as the Chinese universities were coming back into play. And they helped those universities in enormous ways. So for those people to adjust now to a world of Huawei and what's going on with Huawei and the enormously complex space that Canada fell into as a member of a Five Eyes defense group, and at the same time as having arrested somebody directly involved in that company. Then things progressed quite rapidly to the National Institutes of Health, which fund a number of researchers in Canada at our universities, discovering that people who were supposedly reviewing grant applications were actually taking ideas, so idea theft, if you will, and transporting that back to a government. And this then made the National Institutes of Health Research Agency decide they had to change the way in which they conducted peer review. They were also discovering certain people were not declaring all the money they had from all the sources they got it from. And this included people being funded by the 1,000 Talents program. And I just, for those of you who don't know that program, I just want to give you a little bit of history. In 2005, when I went to the University of Montreal, everybody was talking about the China Scholarship Council. And this was this wonderful opportunity where China was going to fund the best and the brightest and send them out to the West to get their PhDs. So we all eagerly, tried to find a way to involve ourselves with some of these students. This then morphed over time. I mean, it went on, but in addition to that, there was an 1,000 Talents program. And in some ways, it sort of looked like an extremely well-funded Canada Excellence Research Chair program. We were giving out 10 million. They were sometimes giving out 100 million. And they brought ethnic Chinese people back to China. Some of the leading stars that had been teaching at MIT, Stanford, Princeton were brought back to China. And in addition, certain scholars and scientists in universities like Harvard and others were being funded to have a shadow lab, all kinds of equipment that you'd like, running full tilt in another place. And they were sometimes receiving money in compensation for participating. So some of these stories have hit the media, but something had grown that some of us weren't sure we even knew about and how to deal with. And then came COVID and an outreach from CSIS to the universities to say, gee, we're seeing a lot of action of a kind that is probably not great, and that's going to threaten some of the intellectual property, some of the medical supplies, some of the things that we need in our country. So all this change has come upon a set of university players. And in addition to that change is the role that CSIS is playing as a helpful partner. People my age who grew up in the United States like I did, remember the 1950s. And the FBI had a bad name. And it was all connected with McCarthyism. So that's been an adjustment for a person like me. Now, some of the researchers in the university have more understanding of geopolitical context than other people. Some people, like me, read in newspapers, as many as I can get my hands on. And I still listen to the radio all the time. And I watch TV. And I have a feed of news on my devices. So I stay up to touch with things, but other people are not that interested in it. So this overtakes certain people in certain areas in the university as like, what are you talking about? What's going on here? And the other problem is, researchers really like to see factual evidence, and you can't show them classified information. So they don't know what you're talking about. They say, but what does it look like? What does it feel like? What does it smell like? How am I supposed to recognize the one in the lab coat? I got all kinds of people in my lab and lab coats, and they come from all different kinds of countries that you're beginning to point fingers at. So this ability to figure out who are the government actors and who are the individuals is quite complex for people. And it's hard for people to sort out. And the first guess is, okay, no more students from that country. No more visiting researchers from that country, because they can't figure out how are they going to identify any of this. So it has been complicated for universities to adjust to these new realities. And in many ways, people say, well, can't somebody decide for us? Can't the government just tell us, don't work with Huawei anymore? Can't the research councils take the responsibility for who we partner with? They have taxpayer money, can't they do that for us? But you know what? You don't actually want universities to lose their autonomy. And at the same time, you don't want them to lose their academic freedom. So we have this complicated space. And I've tried to think, what are the drivers? And, the drivers of who we partner with are sometimes pretty blunt drivers. One of them is money. Some people want to partner with a country that has very large populations because they want to use artificial intelligence means to look at things, and for that they need very large amounts of data. So this makes certain countries seem like more interesting partners than a smaller country, for instance. So they might fall into a partnership driven by the desire for big data. They will fall into a partnership with a company that is offering a lot of money without questioning why that company is offering a lot of money. And frankly, what I discovered, because of a membership that McGill has in an American Association of Universities, the Americans were making a lot more money off of that company than the Canadians were. And that really got me aggravated. And I used to say to people in my partnership office, push them. Ask them why they're giving us $3 million for what they're giving Americans $10 million. I mean, if we're going to go this direction, let's get the goods. But it just showed you that it was a very complicated space in which we would deal. The other thing is people want to know which countries. So there are indications, and I started with people long before we dealt more with CSIS saying, okay, we're not making agreements in countries where we don't have diplomatic relations. North Korea, Iran. And then, you know, when the Canadian Security Agency could point to more government actors that were problematic and include other countries in that, Russia, China, then we can begin to say to people, okay, here's a bit more concrete information for you. The other thing I think that people have had to get straight is a lot of this is protecting them, protecting their intellectual property, their ideas. And that I think is easier for people to gravitate to. Okay, right, I don't want that taken away from me. But it does mean that our universities are really having to put a push on cybersecurity, and all the irritating stuff like this two-factor identification thing makes me crazy. But, you know, it's important. We have to do it. And we have to now have checklists. Before we open your funding account, we want to know how you back up all your data. We want to know what generation equipment you're working on. We have a whole cybersecurity checklist now that's come in addition to the ethics checklist and all the other checklists and procedural forms that people don't like to deal with. But we have to do this to protect ourselves. I think I want to talk a little bit about the impact of living as a close neighbor to the United States. So I told you about what NIH had discovered, but this has meant, and the false reporting of money on NIH grants has made people at NIH reach out to the universities that have researchers funded by NIH and say to them, you've got to report to us. And frankly, you've got to report to, go to Plattsburgh and report to the FBI. You've got to tell us if you become aware of people getting funding from elsewhere that are not reporting it. And that means that the long arm of the United States is reaching into Canada, and it came as a great surprise to some of my VPR colleagues from the United States that a body that funds military funding is also reaching into Canada by telling people exactly which companies' equipment they cannot use. And so they would name a set of companies, and you can guess that one of them would be Huawei, but they named about 4 others. And unfortunately, in our high-performance computing server room, we have equipment made by some of those companies. That means that whole arm of funding is not accessible to Canadians, either seconded as out from an American grant or in a direct grant. So this is all things that one piece at a time we're discovering in our research support offices. The other thing in the United States has been a much more aggressive approach on this, and this has involved the Department of Education, which is a central federal Department of Education, reaching out, requiring an enormous amount of information to be fed back to them, including which donors come from certain countries. All researchers doing anything with those countries. So a very aggressive form of information gathering on universities. And they have limited graduate students from certain countries, namely China, this recently. So there's been an amazing impact on that country under the leadership that had existed for the last 4 years. So this discombobulates some things in Canada. And one of the things, that I thought I could share with you is one of the things that people are doing to help themselves in universities at this time. And one is to develop a working relationship with CSIS and others in the government to help understand what we need to be paying attention to. And there's wonderful guides put out, on cyber guides that were just talked about. We're looking at a different, and we have put in place at McGill, a different approval process for international partnerships and MOUs, which we dig deeper than we used to into the nature of this partnership, this particular university that people are proposing partnership with, and to do what kind of work, and what kind of security do we have around that working relationship. We're also trying to give people help in choosing partners. So where would be good places and not so good places to work, and which kind of partners. So, let me tell you a little bit of this story about the National Defense University, National Defense Technologies University in China. It turns out that somebody has recorded who are the top 10 to do work with this university, and it turns out that McGill is one of them. So I had no idea that we had any engagement with this university. We had no funding, no joint funding. We had no MOUs. I had never even heard the name of this university. But then somebody had the bright idea to go on SciVal and figure out who was co-publishing with people at that university. We all, at the same time, have a policy about the responsible conduct of research, saying research should be done for human benefit and not harm. And that is an implication about doing military-based research. So we tend to look very carefully at any military funding organization that is funding research at McGill to make sure that it is done to not harm people as far as we can figure out. But as I said, there was no funding involved in this. There was no MOUs. There was nothing visible on the surface. But there were people publishing with people. So there were research partnerships. I'm trying to still figure out from people how they got into those partnerships and how they justified themselves to themselves that this wasn't military research of a kind that couldn't cause harm. So because it was directly with a military institution. So there are things here that are hard to discover. You have to peel back layers. You have to also see how does this concord with your existing responsible research policies. And then I think we've had to do some reconsidering of our visitors and the way in which people visit. So at the time I went to the University of Montreal, China was really a strategic destination for that university. So I must have gone about 16 times over the next period of years to China. And I have to say, I was always received in a visitor's room. I was never received in an office. These are fancy visitors' rooms. They have a whole set of protocol with them and wonderful tea. But you didn't just walk people into labs. In fact, if you went to a lab, it didn't actually look like it was that functioning a lab. So I wasn't sure whether this was just a concocted lab. Whereas we take people into all kinds of spaces that have all kinds of important research going on in them, proudly showing it all off, and hoping that nothing will disappear from the lab and pictures will not be taken and ideas will not be stolen. But we're very, perhaps naively generous in the way we receive people, and we have visiting researchers. And many times it's only the professor who invited the researcher that knows that this person is on our campus. So I think we need a little bit more attention to these factors. And finally, in the United States, people, in addition to conflict of interest policies, are asking people to sign conflict of commitment. In other words, are you receiving money from somewhere else? Do you have a shadow lab? I mean, what is the nature of your commitment to another institution or another government? So these are different ways of thinking than we had. Our conflict of interest has been reduced to what are you doing commercially and what kind of company are you trying to spin off, to now beginning to think about what's the source of all your money and what is the implication of that. So it's a very different world. It's hard to adjust to. People have a lot of questions. They would love to see everything in black and white. It isn't actually a black and white world. It's very nuanced. It's hard to understand intentional spying and coerced spying and be able to recognize it, spot it, even think about that world being in our midst in universities. So I hope I've been able to give you a little bit of a sense of what this is like in the university situation. It's not simple. It's hard for me to negotiate it with certain people because they just can't wrap their heads around it. But I think we're having to deal with that. And as Joy said at the beginning, we're seeing two forces collide. Open science is more and more in our face in the last 5 years than it ever was before, and at the same time, foreign interferences. And so we have our hands full to be able to reconcile these things and make them work well together.
Well, thank you ever so much, Martha. That was quite sobering as well, I must say. But, some excellent examples of things that our research community needs to really be thinking about. I'm going to encourage people who are watching online to post questions. I will be happy to share those with our panelists, but I want to get started by just talking a little bit more. All of you have talked about engagement with our universities, and as a president of a university, I'm deeply grateful for the work that you're doing. But my sense is that we've got a long way to go still. And I'm just interested in hearing from you your thoughts on whether this message has been received, and across Canada, whether you think most of our research institutions now are taking these threats seriously and are starting to put measures in place to protect their intellectual property. So maybe I'll start with you, Tricia, and then I'd love to hear from Eric and Martha on this point as well.
Sure. No, I'm happy to say something, and then I'll be really interested in hearing what Martha has to say. Because, this is really quite new to us, and I hope I'm offering that up with as much humility as it actually deserves, because we are really doing our best to get out and engage. And I think we are finding in some places people sort of look at us with a little bit of skepticism, and in other places people are very open and receptive. I think the greatest success we have is when you have someone like Martha speak about this as opposed to Tricia speak about this. I think, we can do everything we can to increase the understanding and the awareness of the threat. And as I said, sometimes when we're going in and talking about something very specific, wow, is there ever a huge appetite? Because when a particular research institute realizes that they've had a real impact on their organization, it's like all the lights came on in the room all at the very same time. So in those cases, it's very, very easy to accept. And in other cases, I would say, and I've been quite honest, some institutes have been very frustrated by, as Martha described, our lack of evidence to them, our lack of ability to fact something, because we have a really hard time giving up the classified information that underpins what it is that we're trying to tell people. So that is a challenge for us, for sure. And I think there is also a sense of frustration about it being put onto the backs and the shoulders of research institutions to try to figure out what to do about it. So I think we're all kind of struggling through this together. We've all got a little piece of the puzzle to be able to bring to it. I don't think it's perfect yet, but I think that, as I said, when an organization realizes that they've had a real impact, they're completely open to hearing from us on that. And then they frankly become the very best advocates to go and talk to their colleagues. I think it's much more impactful than hearing it from us.
So unfortunately, we have to wait for a threat to actually land before we start to take these things seriously, which is, I think, quite problematic. Eric, what's your experience been in terms of trying to work with research institutions?
So I would echo that. Thank you. I would echo that. I think it's a bit early to tell. I'm also quite analytic, and I like to see the numbers and come back in terms of how many we're able to implement the controls. We've tried to push the controls, and some of the, if I can speak about the mitigation measures, the engagements have been fabulous, and we've been they've been very receptive, and our engagements also with I think Martha, you mentioned some of the motivators and the funding funding authorities, funding bodies were also quite positive in terms of considering attaching some of these criteria to possible new grants, and for example, the ones that were being put forward in the COVID emergency. So that's, I think, all very positive. I'm still waiting to see whether we will see that increase in terms of the evidence of reduced number of compromise, for example, in the R&D space or in the R&D / medical pillar. And I think that's something that we could probably get, over the coming months or maybe next year, as we start to see the trends between what was before COVID, what's after COVID, and then what's next year, and how are those compromises shifting. We all are also just about to put out a renewed version of our national cyber threat assessment, and that will be a refresh from the 2018 document, where we'll see kind of the evolution of that threat landscape. So in the next couple of days, you should be seeing some media around that as well. So yeah, that's what I would say from our perspective. I'd wait for a bit more data on the to tell you how successful some of these campaigns are being.
Thank you. What about you, Martha? What do you think?
Yeah.
Are people taking this seriously?
I prefer having Tricia talk than me, but that's okay. I find that there was a lot of ears to this when we had a town hall at the time of COVID. But you have to wait for it to land. Look, McGill had a case all over the newspapers about out and out spying, and nobody was paying any attention internally that this meant anything for them. So, it was sitting in our midst, and nobody could figure out how we missed it, but we did. And then it wasn't until the FBI reached over the border and said, you have this person, and he's connected to this person, and there's a story here. So I'm not sure that woke people up, having that there. I was really surprised after I began to get more in tune with this, how dubious many senior leaders were. And in fact, I think some people who were in government in high enough positions that they had access to see classified information had to say to people, we can't tell you what it is, but we can tell you it's there. You have to believe this. So I think there were some very senior university leaders who had trouble digesting this. And I would hear everything from, X and X university says it has more hacks by the US than any other country. And that would then dismiss having to think about anything more in particular. I think COVID woke people up. And I think the very proactive approach that you took, that you described, Tricia, was really important, because I think all of a sudden people were worried about their and their fellow citizens' health relative to what might be being taken away. But even then, I remember getting on an interview with CBC and having to explain, well, the importance of this is if you invent a vaccine, you may have more access to it than if another country invents it. So if somebody takes that idea elsewhere, you might not see much of that vaccine. So, but I do think it woke people up, and I think your proactive approach really helped in that regard. So, for a long time, I wasn't sure we could wake the funding agencies in Canada up to this until COVID hit and woke CIHR up, because they couldn't figure out how they were supposed to engage in all this. Yeah. I think the other thing that woke some people up was when Parliament in the early winter formed a parliamentary committee on China and began inviting, and you can't turn down one of these invitations, university professors in and questioned them, sometimes in ways that were difficult. So I think slowly there was a kind of dawning, well, somehow this is a bit more real than we thought it was. But there are people denying it.
I want to add something, Martha. I think that was really interesting, because as much as there's a culture shift that's needing to happen in the university institutes, it's having to happen in government as well. I would say that, it's funny how long it took, for example, for CSIS to actually talk about China and threat activities out of China. You will note that for a long time publicly that was very difficult for us to do. And that was because there's a natural tension in government as well. You're attracting foreign investment, and you're also trying to defend against hostile activities. So, COVID was the shift. It really was. And it sort of was remarkable, the risks I think that people felt able to take as a consequence. Our outreach campaign, just as an example, for an organization that's built on secrets, and especially espionage and counterintelligence being the most secret of secrets that we could possibly have, it took an awful huge culture shift for our organization too, and working with CCCS next door to really sort of, they were helpful to us in terms of, it's not so scary, come on out into the deep end, but it was a real challenge. And then we had partners in traditional departments like industry, who I love them all to bits. There's probably a lot of them on the call here. But that was a department, largely built on making sure that they were attracting that type of investment to Canada. So what would it mean when we were out there having these conversations? So there's an awful lot of tension going on in the government. It's not just you that's having to deal with both sides of the coin. So, yeah.
Interesting. There's a question here, kind of, Bill, segues nicely from some of the comments you made. There was in both Martha and your comments, Tricia, you mentioned specifically China. And the question here is, are you concerned that cracking down on international state agents and spying on research could result in targeting and prejudice against certain nationalities when considering whether to receive international grad students, for example, or visiting professors? So I think that's partly the tension that people are concerned about. I'm just wondering if you'd like to comment on that.
I'm really glad that question was asked, Joy, because I actually think it's a really, really huge issue. And we are quite preoccupied by it. I think that we're trying to shift language, because I think there's a tendency in the media in particular just to sort of gloss things over and describe China is the threat in sort of big headlines and so on. China is a very complicated partner. And there are certainly activities that are threatened to Canada's national interest. But that's the government of China, and that's some of the policies that they've affected to ensure that they have all advantages. That's not Chinese people. That's not Chinese students or Chinese professors. There are, links to the apparatus that we have to be really careful about. But I think we have to be extremely conscientious about the way in which we describe the threat publicly. And I don't think we did a particularly good job at the beginning, but I'm hoping that we are getting better and more nuanced at that as well. There's an awful lot of work that we do at CSPC that does sort of go to senses of social cohesion. And, you talk about unnatural partners, we wouldn't used to talk to Heritage Canada, for instance, all that often. But when you start to have discussions about these types of issues, you'd be surprised how much we're now having much more open conversations with them about what does the impact of this kind of a threat descriptor having on the community. So we're alive to it for sure.
One of the things that's been interesting to me with the American Association of Universities that McGill belongs to is as the United States became very heavy-handed through their central request for information from the Department of Education, through the prohibiting of the immigration of certain students from certain countries this fall, there started to be a real pushback. Now, I can see them in a different kind of mind space than I am. Whereas they used to be leading me into a mind space of awareness, they're now starting to feel like, hey, and it isn't the FBI that they're talking about. It's the American government and its apparatus like the Department of Education, immigration, interfering with what they think is the importance of the future of science.
Interesting. Martha, I think you used this term intentional and coerced spying, and there was a specific question about, again, can you elaborate on the difference between these things, and how is it different in terms of identifying it and dealing with them in academia? So I don't know if you want to comment on that, Martha. I think you used the term, or Tricia, you might want to also comment on that clarification of intentional and coerced spying.
Well, I'll try saying what I understand by it, because I might have learned it from CSIS. The intentional is a person who knows when they come into your midst that they are there to spy and have an arrangement that is pre-made. Another person could be a person who comes into your midst and then through coercion back home in their home country to family or to them is incited to report on something that they're observing. And that's my understanding of it. So I distinguished it between the lab coat into two kinds of lab coats. The people came and bought their lab coat up front, and the other people were given a lab coat and, found themselves in an awkward situation.
You nailed it, Martha. You can be an honorary spy. I would throw one extra little category, which is there's an unwitting category as well. People that don't actually know that they're being used. So there's sort of witting, intentional, and there's coerced, and you're quite right. Actually, those are the ones that trouble me the most. And then the middle category is that they're not all knowing about, the degree to which they're being influenced or used as a tool of influence.
There's one other thing I want to raise here, because it came to my attention. We had somebody who had some connections to 1,000 Talents Lab, although somewhat indirect. And I said, do you receive money from them? And no. well, what do you do with the people in that lab? So, well, we exchange data. So I said, well, you're getting their data and you're using it, and they're getting yours. What's the ethical clearance procedure on their data? Do you have any idea? No. And nobody asked. And I think we have to really look at this one, not even in a political framework, but in the framework of ethical conduct of research. If we aren't aware of what the ethics procedures are in a certain country around research, and we're starting to share that data and use it in our own studies, I mean, we're in a very odd situation, actually.
Yeah.
And it hadn't really penetrated to me before.
Many layers. It's interesting, Tricia, you used the notion that our spies are now in lab coats more than trench coats, and I think that's a great reminder for the research community. There is a question here, and this is for both CSIS and the CCCS. Do you think there'd be ever any appetite for granting clearance to a handful of people in academic institutions to act as honest brokers or ambassadors between academics and the intelligence community and initiate some more specific conversations? I think this is around the issue of security and clearance, and how are we going to start to overcome some of these hurdles that we're experiencing. So Eric, has that been talked about at all? Any thoughts about that?
Yeah, so I can talk about it from our perspective, and I'll let Tricia talk from her or our agency's perspective. So for us, yes, there's an absolute appetite for that. It's something that we do engage in with some collaborators in other critical infrastructure pillars. As we engage in more areas, it becomes important. And now maybe not clearing an entire department, as of course there's a cost and an effort required both on the part of the agency, but also on the part of the participant who has to go through several checks in depending on the level. But we are doing this more and more with some key personnel, whether in the leadership or whether sometimes in the security the security roles in various organizations, to give them more access to some of this material so that they can paint a better picture, and then in turn to their organizations without necessarily taking the classified material and exposing it to everyone, but they can then have a stronger motivation for their own internal policy development in this space. So absolutely, yes, it's a good question.
That's great. It's encouraging. How about you, Tricia?
I would be thrilled, absolutely delighted. In fact, I feel like that was a planted question so that I could talk about how important it was to me. Because I alluded to it briefly in my remarks that we do have a slight limitation in our legislation because we exist to provide advice to governments. And as I told you, we do everything we can to try to expand that definition to be able to recognize that government aren't the only ones that need to hear national security advice from CSIS anymore. If ever that was the case, well, it certainly isn't any longer. So academia, the business sector, there are certainly times where you can imagine that being able to, in brief, a chief executive officer of a particular company on economic threats would be of enormous use to our ability to protect the economy. Then there's lots of models. There's lots of ways we could do it. You could issue clearances, you could have working groups, you could have it just up to a secret level as opposed to having to go up to a top secret level. There's lots of ways you can do it. I've also seen it that you could just clear someone just for the purposes of one conversation, just to be able to discuss a very discrete issue. So there's lots of ways to do it. I think the greater risk right now is to not do it than to assume some of the risks that certainly come about when you broaden the kind of aperture of how many people have access to classified information. Risks come alongside, but I think now the threat is so pervasive and so prevalent that we really need to make sure that more people have an understanding of it. So you can just record that and send it to the powers that be.
Excellent. Martha, do you think that universities would be open to that kind of arrangement?
Well, I think that what I was alluding to when I said that some people in government that knew university leaders very well said to them, I've seen it, it's real, you gotta believe it, it's happening at your place. They believed those people because they knew them as credible leaders in government. And so I think that did turn a few heads in universities. And so I think if there was university people that had seen it, I think universities would also pay attention, because they kept saying to me, all you do is you just tell us what's in the newspapers. How do we know whether to believe what's in the newspapers? And of course, we're in this weird era of all this business about false information. So, and conspiracy theory. So it warps people's perception about what you can believe from the public press.
Can I just make one other point, Joy? Sorry, I love to jump in at the end too. Until that time, there are other ways to do it. First of all, doing these broad outreach campaigns as we're doing, hopefully we're building trust so that you actually know the names and the faces of people, so that, to Martha's point, when someone from CSIS comes, I know you know a number of people that work for our organization, and I know you have great trust with and for them, so that certainly helps. But there are other institutions like our review bodies, the National Security Intelligence Committee of Parliamentarians, which is a relatively new parliamentary body, stood up in the last couple of years. They have the ability to look at, they're multi-partisan, they span House of Commons and the Senate, and they have the ability to look at all of our classified information and then be able to discern, a little bit of fact from fiction and hyperbole from, and be able to provide really good neutral reports to be able to let people at the unclassified level understand what's going on behind the scenes. So I would point you to the National Security Committee of Parliamentarians report on foreign interference, that they actually, they tabled it in Parliament, I think on March 13th of this year. I think it was the same day that COVID hit effectively. So it actually slipped underneath the radar a little bit, but it's a fantastic report. And it actually goes a lot farther than I think most people in the security agencies had been kind of comfortable going. But that's another place where people can go to for really trusted advice. Let someone else that's an intermediary do that sort of distillation for you.
Great, thank you. Maybe returning to a point that I made in the introduction around global science projects, open science. Does this mean does this mean that those types of collaborative initiatives are over for us, or how do we start to encourage our researchers to be engaging in this kind of work, given the warnings all three of you have provided, very serious warnings? Is it, Martha, I think you suggested it's a new day dawning, but does that new day mean that we don't pursue global partnerships? What advice would you give about that?
Well, if you want me to advise you, no, definitely not. But I think you have to be very clear who you're picking as partners, and you have to be very clear about everything from, are you sharing data and what's their ethics approval on it? And you have to be very clear that certain countries do not have business law the way we do, so that if you go and do research with them over a product, they can begin to take that product forward themselves, and you don't have much recourse. So, all the way from the intellectual property protection. So I think it's trying to help people figure out partners. And I have to tell you, the Huawei was complex for people, because many people working at Huawei Canada used to be at Nortel. And there are some researchers at McGill that work with these people for years. These were their favorite colleagues. So it was hard for them to adjust that these were now problematic people. Mm-hmm. Yeah, because the company was in a problematic space. So I think, I think we have to go ahead, but I do think people have to be a little bit more careful, and they have to look at their own motivations. When I said to the VP of Research at MIT, how come you're not doing any contracts with Huawei anymore? She said, in the big picture for us, this was small money. It wasn't worth it. So, there's also what is worth it and what's dry.
And to all of Martha's great points, the only one I would add is, and it sort of speaks to, you gave a great example, Martha, about ethics and about your own sort of code of what were you interested in partnering with and for. And I think some of the areas around dual use research and where it might be used for other types of benefits, particularly in the military space, there's probably on a risk matrix, there's probably some things at the upper end of it, which you have to be quite concerned about how it could be used at the end of the day. And there's probably things and I don't know everything about research that all of you do, but other things at the very end of the spectrum, which are all about the public good, that are obviously quite low on the risk spectrum.
Yeah, that's helpful. Eric, do you have anything to add on that?
Yeah, I just those are excellent points, and I would say, yeah, the risk-based approach is one we take throughout our work in security and government and critical infrastructure as well. So, are you okay, or is someone okay having a certain data set or a certain intellectual property out and accessible, and what measures are you willing to take to protect them? I also want to just point back to an excellent point that I thought, Martha, you had made before on the physical visitor rooms and concocted labs, and I thought so definitely collaboration has to keep going, but as we move more and more into a lot of remote working, virtual working spaces, I think there's also an opportunity to work with our IT teams and create these spaces where we can collaborate and we can be very very deliberate about which information we share and which information we don't share, in such a way that perhaps you will want to have your collaborators have access to some data sets, but maybe you don't want them to have access to your entire research network at the university, and that is entirely possible with cloud tenancies that we work on these days. You can really control where you're letting your guests, your visitors in versus your main tenancy for your staff. You can also control where your data is resident. So a lot of the major service providers will offer their services in certain geographical locations. So if you want to reduce some of the risk of your data maybe being subject to foreign regulations or foreign policies that you may not be comfortable with, you can also force that data to reside. So we're talking about the cloud and things seem pretty ethereal, but there are some controls that you can put around where that data resides and then who has access to it. So I think that once we get really, I think all of us are learning in this space, but once we get really comfortable with that, we'll be able to use that to really springboard continued collaboration internationally, I think.
Great, thank you. We're starting to run out of time. We've got about 5 minutes left. Maybe I'll take one more question that's come in from the audience. And that question specifically is, let me just scroll back up, is about collaborating with US. And let me just find it, sorry about that. Right. The severe approach taken by the US government will mean that Canada will be more vulnerable to foreign nationals moving north of the border for quote-unquote opportunities. What's your consultation plan with the US intelligence services to ensure Canada is prepared? So I think, obviously we're part of a global dynamic, and we may be at greater risk right now because of some of the positioning that the United States has taken. Are we working closely with the United States? Are we engaging more closely right now because of this dynamic? What would you say, Tricia?
So I would say that the United States, for sure. I think that lots of you will have heard about our Five Eyes partnership. So that is our close relationship we have on the intelligence side, both from the human intelligence perspective and my colleagues on the signals intelligence or the cyber intelligence perspective. So the United Kingdom, Australia, New Zealand, and the United States. And that alliance, which has existed for 60-odd, 70-odd years, I think, Eric's going to correct me if I'm wrong there, this is a Second World War kind of phenomena, is incredibly robust. And I think that is one of our principal tools in our toolbox to be able to deal with hostile state activity, is the richness of that relationship between those five partners. There can certainly be a geopolitical dimension that is added to the top of that. And I think that the relationship between Canada and the United States over the last little while has kind of gone through its fair share of that. And I would say beneath the geopolitical level, though, the work of the intelligence agencies is completely non-affected by that type of shift at the more surface level. I'll put it that way. So we have really, really productive and really close dialogues with them. And if we didn't have it, we wouldn't be able to provide that kind of joined up advice to universities. So I don't think that universities here in Canada are hearing much differently than our colleagues in the United States or in Australia or in the United Kingdom. When you see guidelines come out for research institutions, you'll see there's an awful lot of not overlap or duplication, but we're very, very stitched up. So I think it's one of the biggest benefits that we have, and I think it's one of the things that probably causes our adversaries to stay up at night, is how strong that alliance is and how great the intelligence sharing is.
Thanks. We've got, maybe I'll just do a quick round to see if anybody else wants to, on the panel wants to make any final comments, 30-second comments as we start to close out. Martha, any final advice for people listening in today?
The final advice is we do have to be careful that we don't scapegoat people from different countries in the world who are on our campuses. So, I mean, I think it's complicated, but I mean, we have to bear in mind government actors and then particular individuals and individuals who have nothing to do with anything. But, you know, it makes certain groups feel very vulnerable, and we have to recognize that.
Thanks, Martha. Eric, any final advice for those listening in?
No, just again, thanking you for the work that you do in pushing our country and our innovation forward. And we'd really love to help further with any security questions, anything about future cloud identity, things of that nature, and to help you further your work and your mission. Thank you.
Thanks, Eric. Tricia, any last words for those participating?
Just to echo both, like Eric and Martha picked up on two pieces, actually the same puzzle, which is that it's a complex problem. And I think it requires us to have a really nuanced and very thoughtful response. So the work that we're able to do in partnership with you, I think, is really, really important. And I hope everybody will start to see it as a true partnership. I think gone are the days where CSIS was in dark shadows, and also the way where we were describing the threat without any sophistication or nuance. To your point, Martha, I think it's extremely important that we define what is a threatening activity or a threatening actor, as opposed to, anything that might have an impact on people or their lives or their livelihoods, for that matter.
Thanks, Tricia. Well, listen, I've certainly learned a lot from today's panel. I think that, it's been pointed out that we've got a bit of a patchwork situation here in Canada right now. Many institutions, some of us naive, others learning, others very much aware. But what I'm heartened by is this commitment to partnership, to reaching out, to thinking about new approaches to really deal with these risks that will protect our science and our intellectual property. So on behalf of the Canadian Science Policy Conference, I want to thank our panelists for joining me here today and really sharing your time with us. I want to thank the audience as well for posing great questions. And I think Eric, Tricia, and Martha have pointed to some great resources as well. So I encourage you to follow those leads as we continue to protect our science in Canada. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.